If you're enjoying this tale from the Old West, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of courage, justice, and redemption from the frontier days. Your support helps us bring these forgotten legends to life. The dusty town of Cedar Ridge had seen its share of hardships, but nothing quite prepared its residents for what would unfold on that scorching Tuesday morning in 1873. Miss Eleanor Whitmore had arrived in town just 3 months prior, carrying nothing more than a worn leather satchel filled with books and an unwavering determination to educate the children of this remote frontier settlement. Eleanor was unlike any woman the townsfolk had ever encountered. At 26, she possessed a sharp intellect that had been honed at the finest schools back east, and her refined mannerisms stood in stark contrast to the rough-hewn character of Cedar Ridge. She had come west not for adventure or gold, but because she believed every child deserved an education, regardless of how far from civilization they lived. The schoolhouse she inherited was little more than a ramshackle wooden structure with gaps between the boards that let in both wind and rain. But Eleanor saw potential where others saw decay. Within weeks, she had organized the older boys to help patch the roof, convinced the local carpenter to donate materials for new desks, and even started a small library with books donated from back east. Sheriff Buck Morrison, however, viewed Eleanor's arrival with suspicion and barely concealed contempt. A man in his early 40s with a reputation for keeping order through intimidation rather than justice, Morrison had ruled Cedar Ridge with an iron fist for nearly a decade. He saw Eleanor's education efforts as a threat to the established order, fearing that book learning might give the townsfolk ideas above their station. Morrison's animosity toward Eleanor became apparent during their first encounter at the general store. When she politely asked him to help resolve a dispute between 2 of her students' families over school supplies, he laughed dismissively and declared that children in Cedar Ridge had no need for fancy book learning when there was honest work to be done in the mines and ranches. The tension between them simmered for weeks, with Morrison finding every opportunity to undermine Eleanor's authority. He would deliberately schedule town meetings during school hours, forcing parents to choose between their children's education and community obligations. He spread rumors that Eleanor was filling the children's heads with dangerous Eastern ideas that would make them dissatisfied with frontier life. The breaking point came on a particularly busy Saturday, when the town square was filled with families conducting their weekly business. Eleanor had brought several of her students to the general store to purchase supplies for a science experiment she had planned. The children were excited, chattering about the wonders of chemistry and physics that their teacher had promised to demonstrate. Sheriff Morrison happened to be standing outside the saloon when he overheard the children's enthusiastic conversations about their lessons. His face darkened with anger, and he strode purposefully toward the group. The townspeople, sensing trouble brewing, began to gather around, forming an impromptu audience for what was about to unfold in the dusty street. Morrison planted himself directly in front of Eleanor, his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. His voice carried clearly across the square as he began his verbal assault. He declared that Eleanor was corrupting the children with useless knowledge that would make them too good for honest frontier work. He accused her of being a troublemaker who was trying to change the natural order of their community. The sheriff's voice grew louder and more aggressive as he warmed to his theme. He told the gathered crowd that Eleanor was nothing but a spinster who had failed to find a husband back east and was now trying to make herself important by filling children's heads with nonsense. His words were deliberately chosen to wound, attacking not just her profession, but her character and personal life. Eleanor stood frozen as Morrison continued his public humiliation. He questioned her qualifications, suggesting that no real teacher would waste her time in a backwater town like Cedar Ridge unless she had been run out of everywhere else. He implied that her unmarried status made her unfit to influence impressionable young minds. painting her as a bitter woman, taking out her disappointments on innocent children. The crowd watched in uncomfortable silence as Morrison delivered his final insult. He declared that if Eleanor truly cared about the children's welfare, she would pack up her books and head back east, where her fancy ideas belonged. He suggested that the town would be better off without her disruptive influence, and that the children could learn everything they needed to know from their parents and honest work. Eleanor's face burned with shame and anger, but she maintained her composure despite the public humiliation. The children clustered around her looked confused and frightened, unable to understand why their beloved teacher was being treated so cruelly. Several parents in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, torn between their respect for Eleanor and their fear of crossing the powerful sheriff. As Morrison finished his tirade and swaggered back toward the saloon, Eleanor gathered her students and quietly led them back to the schoolhouse. The remainder of that day passed in a blur of whispered conversations throughout the town as residents debated the confrontation they had witnessed. Some agreed with Morrison that Eleanor was overstepping her bounds, while others felt that his public attack had been unnecessarily cruel. That evening, Eleanor sat alone in her small quarters behind the schoolhouse, seriously considering whether Morrison might be right about her not belonging in Cedar Ridge. The humiliation had been devastating, made worse by the fact that it had occurred in front of her students and their parents. She wondered if her efforts to bring education to the frontier had been nothing more than naive idealism. Her brooding was interrupted by a soft knock at her door. When she opened it, she found Marshal James Hartford standing on her threshold, his hat in his hands and concern evident in his weathered features. Hartford was a federal marshal who had been investigating reports of corruption and abuse of power in several frontier towns, including Cedar Ridge. Marshal Hartford was a man of different caliber entirely from Sheriff Morrison. In his late 30s, he carried himself with quiet confidence rather than bluster, and his reputation was built on fairness and genuine dedication to justice. He had been in town for several days, staying at the hotel while conducting his investigation, and he had witnessed Morrison's public attack on Eleanor. Hartford's presence at Eleanor's door was both professional and personal. He had been observing the dynamics in Cedar Ridge and had quickly identified Morrison as exactly the kind of corrupt official he had been sent to investigate. But his concern for Eleanor went beyond his professional duties. He had been impressed by her dedication to the children and appalled by the treatment she had received. The marshal's investigation had revealed a pattern of abuse and corruption that extended far beyond his treatment of Eleanor. Morrison had been taking bribes from local criminals, allowing them to operate with impunity as long as they shared their profits with him. He had been extorting money from local businesses under the guise of providing protection, and he had used his position to settle personal grudges and eliminate anyone who challenged his authority. Hartford spent the next several days gathering evidence and building his case against Morrison. During this time, he made it a point to visit the schoolhouse and observe Eleanor's teaching methods firsthand. What he saw there only confirmed his initial impression of her dedication and competence. The children clearly adored their teacher, and their enthusiasm for learning was evidence of her skill and commitment. As Hartford's investigation progressed, he found himself increasingly drawn to Eleanor, not just as a victim of Morrison's abuse, but as a remarkable woman whose strength and intelligence commanded his respect. Their conversations during his visits to the school revealed a sharp mind and a compassionate heart that had been shaped by genuine conviction rather than mere sentiment. The confrontation between Hartford and Morrison came exactly 1 week after the public humiliation incident. The marshal had completed his investigation and obtained a warrant for Morrison's arrest on multiple charges of corruption, abuse of office, and violations of federal law. He waited until the sheriff was making his usual rounds through the town square, ensuring maximum visibility for what was about to transpire. Hartford approached Morrison with the same quiet confidence that marked all his actions. When he announced that Morrison was under arrest, the corrupt sheriff initially laughed, assuming it was some kind of joke. His laughter died quickly when Hartford produced his credentials and the arrest warrant, making it clear that this was no laughing matter and that Morrison's reign of terror in Cedar Ridge was over. The townspeople who gathered to witness Morrison's arrest experienced a mix of shock and relief. Many had suffered under his corrupt rule, but had been too afraid to speak out against him. Seeing him led away in shackles was a moment of vindication for everyone who had been victimized by his abuse of power, and it marked the beginning of a new chapter for their community. With Morrison removed from power, Eleanor found that the atmosphere in Cedar Ridge changed dramatically. Parents who had been intimidated into keeping their children away from school began sending them back. The town council, no longer under Morrison's influence, voted to provide additional funding for educational supplies and improvements to the schoolhouse building itself. Marshal Hartford's duties required him to remain in Cedar Ridge for several more weeks, while he completed the paperwork related to Morrison's case and helped establish proper law enforcement procedures for the town. During this time, his respect and admiration for Eleanor continued to grow, and he found himself reluctant to leave when his official business was concluded. The relationship between Eleanor and Hartford developed naturally through their shared conversations about justice, education, and their hopes for the future of frontier communities. Hartford had seen too many towns where ignorance and lawlessness went hand in hand, and he recognized that Eleanor's work was essential to building the kind of civilized society that would make the West a place where families could thrive. Eleanor, for her part, found in Hartford a man whose commitment to justice matched her own dedication to education. His quiet strength and integrity provided a stark contrast to Morrison's bullying tactics, and she appreciated his genuine interest in her work and his respect for her intelligence and independence. Their courtship was conducted with the propriety expected of a school teacher and a federal marshal, but their mutual attraction was evident to everyone in the community. Hartford made it clear that he would not ask Eleanor to abandon her calling for marriage, and Eleanor appreciated his understanding that her work was not just a job, but a vocation that defined her purpose in life. The wedding took place 6 months later in the same town square where Eleanor had endured her public humiliation. The entire community turned out to celebrate the union of the teacher who had brought learning to their children and the marshal who had brought justice to their town. The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful, representing not just the joining of two lives, but the triumph of decency over corruption. Marshal Hartford arranged for a transfer to a position that would allow him to remain based in Cedar Ridge, while still carrying out his federal duties throughout the territory. Eleanor continued her work as the town's teacher, but now with the full support of her husband and the community that had come to recognize the value of what she brought to their lives. The story of Eleanor Whitmore's transformation from a humiliated outsider to a respected member of the community became a legend in Cedar Ridge. Her marriage to Marshal Hartford was seen as a fairy tale ending, but those who knew them best understood that their partnership represented something more significant than personal happiness. It symbolized the victory of justice and education over ignorance and corruption. Years later, when Eleanor's former students had grown up and started families of their own, they would tell their children about the brave teacher who had stood up to tyranny and the noble marshal who had rescued both her and their town from the grip of a corrupt sheriff. The story became part of the oral history of Cedar Ridge, passed down through generations as an example of how courage and integrity could triumph over oppression. What do you think made Marshal Hartford different from Sheriff Morrison? Was it his respect for education, his commitment to real justice, or something else entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments below about what qualities make a true leader in times of trouble.